So about a month ago, the next FNAF game got leaked, and I know I'm very late to acknowledging this, but I think I'm ready to talk about it. If you know me well enough, you are probably very well aware that I am a huge, passionate fan for Five Nights at Freddy's, but I am especially a huge, passionate fan for the mythology and extended universe. The issue is these extended universe settings come from the books only. The games don't really expand much on it. The other issue is that the books have a negative reputation because of their lack of accessibility. This game, however, I think is going to change that. Five Nights at Freddy's has grown a reputation as being a mysterious franchise with a hidden lore. I think over time, this has changed because of the games developing a more coherent story and universe within themselves. However, people seem to still take this as a puzzle. I don't think that's the case, and I think that has caused a pretty negative effect on the perception of the franchise and also how the media within it is interpreted. While it's not necessarily an issue to think that the books are non-canon, people also seem to extend that thought process into completely devaluing the books overall as their existence of a medium. And it's very disheartening given most of the mythology and extended universe for what makes FNAF operate as something very cool is shoved aside in priority for the hunt for lore. And while that may seem to be something hard for a lot of people to swallow, I think that this game is going to establish that lore isn't always important, and that lore is something that we have glorified over time. The focus on lore and less of the narrative and world building around us has led to us completely disregarding the true potential of what FNAF as a universe can be. If you are a casual fan that does not read the books, you are probably very well aware of the mindset that these books exist only for lore purposes and that they parallel important events within the games and don't actually happen. While it is okay to think that these are separate universes, there comes a point where people tend to not actually appreciate them as individual worlds and events themselves. As someone who has read all the books, there is a lot of very cool world building that is completely ignored due to the lack of accessibility to the books. The games do not have this world building. However, if we merge these two worlds, like this game is doing, we have something very cool. I'm going to go over just how very in-depth and detailed that this game is, because it is awesome, okay? The studio behind this has done a really good job with staying faithful. This game, Into the Pit, is obviously based off of this story, which is about the notorious time-traveling ball pit. However, a lot of details are ignored and missed. The cover art for Into the Pit, which has multiple variations, is very, very faithful to the original story, but also Fazbear Frights as a whole. While this game is actually adapting Into the Pit only, it still shows connectivity to other parts of the continuity that is within. In Fazbear Frights, at the end of the epilogues, it is revealed that the ball pit from this story is actually a living being powered by the pain of several trapped souls that are within it. In one of the covers for Into the Pit, the game, we see this symbolized with human hands crawling out from the pit. This isn't just for a cool visual, but rather this is literally visualizing what the true nature of the pit is. Another way of this being shown is also with the bleeding black liquid. In the books, it is revealed that the ball pit is bleeding every year it claims a victim. We see this visualized with the black liquid, which is also revealed to be blood, falling from the ceiling. And the connections of establishing continuity, consistency, doesn't stop with the books as well, but with the games. A huge issue people had with Fazbear Frights and the thought process of applying them to the same continuity of the games was the lack of acknowledgement of details that would match with the games themselves. This game completely fixes that. The same thing happens with the Mimic, which appeared in Ruin. In Ruin, we did see the Mimic, which was a character that came from the book. However, people still had issue where you needed the books to understand where this character came from. Into the Pit completely fixes this by fusing these mediums together as one narrative, one singular game. And in that process, includes connections to the games that we prior would not have seen within the books themselves. On the ARG site for Jeff's Pizza, there are actually dates that establish when these posts are being made. 2020. All of the posts are being made in the year 2020. This is establishing a date. For what other reason would you apply a date to this game unless it is connected to the other games? More specifically, a game adapting a story that was known to be confusing due to its time placement. Even in some of the blog posts, you see more connections to the games that the book themselves didn't actually elaborate on. Not only does this give world building for the books, but the games themselves by connecting and intertwining them. It's revealed that Jeff from Jeff's Pizza graduated in the year 1987, which is a really cool reference to, the year 1987. In the process, it also includes a setting, which, by the way, is a pretty minor setting from the book, Westbrook Elementary, in the same post. This gives the developers a way to establish both of these worlds in a satisfactory manner, something that the books did not do prior, as well as the games. Going even deeper, there is a location in the original story called The Mill. This location is only mentioned 3 times in the entire book, and is only served as a purpose to explain why the town is dying, and why the town is not in a good economic state. Nobody really cared about this location whatsoever. On the ARG site for the game, if you look into the files, you can find a screenshot titled The Mill. And in this screenshot is something huge. You see the trash in the gang from FNAF 6, as well as Helpy, and what is assumed to be Happy Frog. This is directly fusing a connection of events between games, as well as serving as missing pieces for the standalone story that the original book was. In FNAF 6, we get to see that the trash in the game come from something called Dumpster Diving Weekly. In Into the Pit, we see them in a dumpster. We know for a fact that FNAF 3 and FNAF 6 are within the year 2023. If we connect these 2 games together, Into the Pit being in 2020 and FNAF 6 being in 2023, we can infer that this is where Michael went. This is where Michael got the trash in the game. This fits perfectly into the game timeline seamlessly, as well as the Into the Pit book. Maybe this is because they are the same continuity. I can go even further with this. In the actual pizzeria area of the game, we can see things that were not mentioned in the original book. That being Golden Freddy, as well as other drawings from the previous games that we have seen, but in pixel art style. This is establishing even more continuity to the games visually than what the book could do as a text format. This is unifying these 2 together to show they're one and the same. There are also details that could potentially help us place the events of when certain characters died. In the game where we are in Freddy's, which in the story takes place in 1985, we see a picture of Circus Baby. This is pretty indicative that tells us Circus Baby was made before 1985, placing Elizabeth's death before the missing children's incident. That is huge. That is a huge inferable connection from just existing. And if you want to argue that maybe I'm looking too deep into this, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. On the ARG site, the developers actually left in older versions of the assets that are used for the website. In one of these assets are a menu and word search. There's also a pamphlet which gives us the copyright date of 1985 next to Jeff's Pizza, as well as the town location of Westbrook. Now, this would contradict the book and also the games. For one, Jeff's Pizza did not exist in 1985. Jeff's Pizza used to be Freddy's. The town name, however, was never mentioned to be Westbrook in the book, which would contradict the assumption that it is the same as the games, which is Hurricane, Utah. This is actually fixed in the most up-to-date version of the asset on the website. Both the 1985 copyright date and the name of the town, which was accidentally put as Westbrook, are removed to prevent confusion. This shows that the developers are intentionally looking at small details to make sure there is no confusion of the world building around them. It shows us that they are putting pretty distinct details for what's going on. This is why I think this game is going to be huge, because it unifies these two aspects of the lore which prior were not considered to be one and the same. This can hopefully change how we perceive this as a multimedia franchise. Prior, it was considered that the books and games are always separate continuities because of different mediums. It being a book means that it's a separate world, it being a game means it's in the games. That is the main consensus and assumption right now. But the truth is, this comes from the common misconception of what the original reason for why the books from the original trilogy were considered alternate universes. Within the first 4 original FNAF games, the story was told out of order and without an in-depth world. Everything was scattered around as pieces without any actual timeline connection in between events of the games. They were isolated events, kind of like an anthology. At the time of FNAF 4, Scott Cawthon considered this to be the final game and that the story within these games and isolated events were concluded and did not require any more in-depth development. The issue was the fact that there was a portion of the fandom that was lost and confused with the fact that there was no actual world being put in this. His solution to this was, instead of him making individual stories and adding on to the pre-existing story that he considered finished, was to completely revisit the universe in a completely different timeline. This is why the books of the original trilogy were considered separate universes. This, however, did not satisfy people enough because of how the canonicity of them was strange. We did not know exactly what we could apply to the games and what was exclusively books. This is why Fazbear Frights came around and is something that people seem to have forgotten. Fazbear Frights existed to fill in the gaps that the games were missing from the isolated events between each other. These books existed to give us answers that a game did not have full capacity to do. A lot of questions relied on things that relied on overall mythology rather than actual narrative that a game itself could tell. Each game tells its own story. You cannot fit multiple of these answers within one condensed story without it being too crowded. That is why anthologies exist. In fact, Braden Cawthon, Scott Cawthon's son, who is now an author himself, actually put this very well with his own method of writing. When you are developing universes between installments, there can be questions that the audiences require to be explained. Instead of answering every single one of them by making a completely different installment, you can solve this predicament by including anthologies. And this example is pretty accurate because of how Scott kept repeating this cycle of answering things. A big thing with FNAF 6 and its development was how people required answers, and how he kept having to answer things in every game. This became tiring. His solution of fixing this is by making an anthology which filled in these gaps, while also working on games. This fits perfectly with what he said in his post, with how the games look forward and the books look backward, filling in the missing gaps of the timeline while the story can move forward with the games. Unfortunately, a lot of people, especially game theory, I'm not trying to throw shade at anything, but this misinterpretation has led to this debate of what's canon and what's not. The main sole cause of this is the glorification of lore, and that everything must be important. This leads us all to thinking that all 32 stories of the anthology series have to be an answer to the lore, and that there's some secret meaning behind them all. That is completely misunderstanding what the point of an anthology is. An anthology is supposed to serve as gaps, just like Scott Cawthon put it. These gaps could hopefully lead us into understanding a greater story of the world surrounding the actual main narrative, which will hopefully lead us to being pushed in the right path. The thought process of approaching these as being just parallels or just analogies for the actual lore have led to many unsatisfactory conclusions. And Scott Cawthon even puts this himself in his post about it. The fact is that there is a completely huge open-ended story here that requires development, and that there are way too many headcanons that can be axed. A lot of people will not be satisfied with this. The exact thing happened in the Fazbear Fright series, giving us the answer that Andrew is the one you should not have killed, and not Cassidy, like the main consensus was, is unsatisfactory because it is giving us something that we thought was more important than it was. In fact, this fits with what exactly Mr. Hippo was saying in Ultimate Custom Night.
I said to him, Orville, not every story has to have significance, Sometimes, sometimes a story is just a story. If you try to read into every little thing and find meaning in everything anyone says, you'll just drive yourself crazy. Had a friend do it once. Wasn't pretty. We talked about it for years. And not only that, but you'll likely end up believing something you shouldn't believe and thinking something you shouldn't think, or assuming something you shouldn't assume,
Not everything has to matter. It's sometimes just a story. Treating FNAF overall as a mystery can be both harmful and beneficial, but it is important to show a distinction. I think this game is going to be showing us that distinction by unifying both worlds. The games can settle as their own mysterious, vague traditional lore explanation, while the books can serve as the actual straight-up answers that the games could not give us. This is the way we should look at it, but obviously that is not working, hence why we are revisiting Into the Pit. Because you cannot visually see the world around you within a book, it is hard to tell what exactly it looks like and if it is similar to the world of the games. By unifying these together, we can visually see this, and we can see things that the story of the book did not depict, including details that we did not know existed prior because they just were not important to the story of Into the Pit. And a lot of people seem to take this as meaning it's a completely different story. Just because we can go a different route and see things that weren't in the story means it's a completely different continuity. It just means we have control now. And that is huge, and an opportunity I feel like we should not miss. The fact is, with every FNAF game, we have a set story, but we don't always know exactly what the continuity's ending is going to be. We have multiple endings always. We don't know where the story is going. This time, we do. We have a book. We have a book that tells us the story of Into the Pit, how it happens. The game itself gives us the position and power to go into that story and control the story. We can explore the world that the book could not do. That is huge. We are given control to explore the world around us like a game, not as a book limited to text, but putting us in both worlds. The fact is that there are multiple endings to this game as it is mentioned in the description. And that alone should tell you that this game is pretty huge. The fact that it is a mainline game that is focusing particularly on a Fazbear Fright story in the middle of a huge book debate. That should be self-explanatory. This game should hopefully tell the fandom that this story doesn't always have to be meaningful for lore. This story is also a world. Just because it's a book doesn't mean it has to be important to the lore. Sure, if it's connected in the same continuity, it can connect to important events, but that does not mean it is required. I mean, it's just an event that happens in the same continuity. A huge example of this is with Portal and the comic Lab Rat. At the end of Portal 1, you escape and kill GLaDOS. However, when you get into the events of Portal 2, you are for some reason brought back into stasis, and you were saved by someone. This is not explained in the actual game, and it leaves a big question and hole as to what actually led to the events there. I mean, you can find hints in the game to establish connections, but there is a huge missing piece here. The only way to understand what happened is because the developers gave us an opportunity of filling in the gaps. The way of them doing this was establishing continuity and connection to a book called Lab Rat. This serving as an explanation for why the main protagonist is able to be in the second Portal game. This exists for the developers to continue the story without including a completely new character that is irrelevant to the narrative events of the game. The same thing can be applied to the FNAF books. In short, there is just a lot of opportunities with this game, and I hope that the fandom accepts this for what it is and finally realizes that not everything has to be lore or mean something. And hopefully this game isn't treated as some side story or, fun 10th anniversary project. While sure, it is releasing on the 10th anniversary, that doesn't mean it's not a main game or installment. I see a lot of people making the argument that just because it's a game doesn't mean it's canon, because we have stuff like the Troll games, as well as Freddy in Space. This is not comparable. Number one, this is a paid game that is made by a studio and is being sold on platforms. Number two, this game was almost going to be at PAX last year alongside Help Wanted 2. I got permission to say this by someone, and I have verified this with many other people, but that is the case. This game was going to be at PAX. That alone is pretty huge. The only reason why it didn't happen was due to scheduling conflict. If it is big enough to be at a convention with another mainline title, then hopefully when the official announcement for this game and when we get an actual trailer, the fandom will finally realize how big this game actually is and the opportunities it can bring. I have so much hope for this game. And regardless of lore, I hope Megacat Studios gets the praise and, all the support they can get. Because the way this game got announced was not... It is definitely not the way you want your game announced. Please give them support, because they have worked their asses off on this game. And they are such a small team as well. Anywho, it's been great making this video. Talk to you guys later. I'm going to be trying making more content soon. Peace.